Gertrude, before you go, please tell us, what's the answer? And we're told she pulled herself up in bed and said, what's the question? The capacity to define the crisis is the capacity to exert enormous media and political power. What is the crisis? Is it the deficit? Is it high unemployment? Is it 50 million people with no health care coverage and others underinsured with little or no access to quality health care in many cases? Is it environmental degradation, deterioration of the infrastructure, the veterans coming home shattered with their bodies and their spirits? We can go on to talk about where the crises are. But those are, so to speak, inconvenient crises that are being deflected frequently by those with the power, political megaphone, and capacity to keep riveting the crisis somewhere else. And we're now in a circumstance where it's impossible to kick the can down the road very much farther. And we're seeing what happens when, after cutting budgets to the bone, they're cut again and again, or the school class size is larger where teachers are being fired. And we know on and on, we could fill the evening and many evenings talking about some of the cascading effects. I think if we look at macro, and it can be sliced many different ways. But these problems, I believe, not to be, so to speak, reductionist about it, but these problems tend to be concentric. And if we talk about, for instance, the runaway global warming, we talk about Wall Street being able to dictate the terms of its own bailout. A woman trying to get food stamps has to sign. If you get food stamps to the government, you will do and you will not do A, B, and C. And yet, and I'm proud to say I wrote a piece in the IJ the week of the bailout argument in the fall of 2008 against the bailout, when the sky was falling. The Treasury Secretary pulled 3 pages out of his back pocket, and all of a sudden we were stampeded to this enormous bailout of the financial services industry. And very little requirement. In many ways, the woman trying to get food stamps was held to an extremely high standard, and these huge banks, which then used the money to buy other banks rather than create liquidity, were held to very little standard whatsoever. That is the reality that we're living under. And the austerity, or what other name we put under it, has been cascading from federal to state to local. I often use the example, and I think it's instructive, that during an 8-year period in the last decade studied by the National Priorities Project, the federal budget went up 28%, the federal grants to state and local governments went up 14%, and the federal military spending went up 41%. You see where it goes. There's that saying, if you keep going somewhere, you'll probably get there. Or as Martin Luther King said a year before his death, a nation that year after year continues to spend more on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. Well, some people may define it as infrastructure deterioration or civic malaise or growing inequality or spiritual death or whatever one chooses to call it. But we're now in 2011 dealing with these consequences and these concentric problems, the growing inequality, the economic degradation of our capacity to even generate locally based jobs, bringing Target in, for instance, as was voted in this very room just a couple of months ago. The ecological crisis, which is accelerating despite all the warnings to the contrary. The more than well over $2 billion a day spent on the military. These and so many other crises are concentric, and I believe at the core is the problem of runaway corporate power. And it's the problem that a wide spectrum of elected officials and others that dares not speak its name. It's right in front of us, and yet corporate power is driving so much that's driving us over a cliff in so many different ways. And also a dire shortage of democracy. And of course, democracy is sort of a toss-off term, and it's a rhetorical, helium balloon that we see floating over us all the time, and we often discount it for good, perhaps skeptical reasons, because the currency of the word has been so devalued. It seems to be so counterfeit in how it's presented to us, and yet it's really the only antidote. It's really the only solution to dealing with the way in which more and more economic, which is to say political power, is concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. And it's only from the grassroots and only with an authentic re-identification with and adherence to the principles of and fighting for authentic grassroots democracy that we have an antidote, so to speak, to this poison of corporate power, which is antithetical to democracy. You know, it shouldn't be $1, one vote. It shouldn't be one shareholder, one vote, or one big box store adherent, one vote. It should be a person having that capacity to be part of the civic dialogue. And that profundity, if you will, has been turned into just cliche, and then what we've seen in the last 3 years, unfortunately, is that hope has been given a bad name. Hope has been kindled, and then through putting people from Wall Street in charge of regulating Wall Street, putting people in the Interior Department in charge of regulating BP, having an entire cabinet at the federal level largely involved with giving more and more ground to those who FDR denounced as, in his time, the economic royalists. And we are facing, I think, a profound political challenge right now at every level, which is the cascading effects of austerity, by their name, being felt in community after community, in almost every sphere, from neonatal care to the elderly. We're seeing this capacity of a rapacious, corporate, profit-driven set of priorities to ravage people's lives. And our capacity to name it and to organize, to challenge, is really what hangs in the balance. If we can't do it, then the results are predictable. Lynn Woolsey spoke here in the rally down the street a little over a week ago, I think it was. Talked about to reporters, we're in 5 wars now. You know, count them, 5 wars, and yet we're told there aren't even hostilities because the War Power Act should not be invoked. And yet the cost to us in terms of not only economic, but also the cynicism that is increased, the sort of the Orwellian ambience that is created. And then we have at the state level, yes, I'm glad that we don't have Queen Meg as governor. But after 40 years of struggle, farm workers were at the threshold of a decent law for being able to form unions in the fields. With a shameful veto, we have a governor who has rolled back that historic possibility. We can talk about at the federal level how that's been done in terms of jobs creation. This notion has been propagated that we create jobs through an employment creation replica of trickle-down economics, sort of trickle-down jobs creation, which is a fantasy. We're going to give tax breaks to businesses, and that's going to create jobs. And there are studies showing it costs the Treasury $200,000 to $250,000 to create a job that way. You can do it through federal jobs programs with maybe $50,000, $60,000 instead, and yet that's the road not taken. And I'd sum up this way: we need to redefine crisis. What is the crisis? How do we define the causes of the crisis? And then most importantly, if that is the ailment of our society, the deep, structurally driven malaise and disease, if you will, of our society right now, what are the antidotes? And the antidotes are to speak clearly to each other, not only to power, but about power. Power knows what it's doing. Wall Street knows what it's doing. Those at the intersection of Wall Street and Pennsylvania Avenue who are giving away so much of our public space to private gain, they know what they're doing. We have the capacity to speak, not so much, I think, importantly, truth to power, but truth about power to each other. So our eyes are not lifted up to the heavens of the powerful and rich, but to each other. That's how organizing has always been done when it's effective, and we can do it now and in the future. And I can't think of a better person to talk about that than Lisa.